So, scientific metaphysics is what you might call an ongoing philosophical program with a view characterized by solving problems in metaphysics, predominantly through the aid of empirical science, rather than as seen typically in analytic philosophy, through the means of predominantly working with pure abstract reasoning. Here, by metaphysics, we mean the branch of philosophy studying questions such as ultimate reality, existence, causality, etc. Or alternatively, metaphysics is the part of philosophy which aims to give an account of the nature and structure of all that there is. I find a good way to think about this is if you imagine having a piece of paper and you are asked to write down everything that could exist, as well as everything you could imagine existing. Now, we want to try in this short video to do the following. Number 1, we want to try to give an account of what motivates scientific metaphysics. Number 2, ask how this view challenges the existing framework of how metaphysics is currently practiced. And finally, number 3, give a brief overview of some of the suggestions that have been made concerning this discipline and how it could potentially work better than the existing paradigm or view. I will of course also discuss some challenges to the view at the end of the video. We can start by giving some motivation. There is a long-held view, particularly as an outside perspective from non-philosophers, that metaphysics is very much an activity done from the armchair, which immediately brings into question the reliability of this process. After all, we can ask, are questions concerning space, causality, time and consciousness, to name a few, really questions that are best answered from this armchair perspective? Many have taken the answer to this question to be an affirmative no, historically with the most vocal group being the logical positivists. Now, granted, the questions we are interested in here concern philosophical questions, typically general foundational questions such as what is the nature of time, or does causality exist independently or come into being, in which philosophers have argued that such questions lie outside the scope of physical science. However, a closer investigation, into both the range of such questions as well as the sociology of philosophical practice, reveals that these questions very often overlap strongly in terms of interest with the sciences. As an example, consider the philosopher Tim Maudlin, who is motivated by answering foundationalist questions within physics, and who thinks that these sorts of questions are a natural part of what should be asked and addressed within the physics community itself. That is, he takes it that answering questions concerning the foundations of physics belongs to a set of questions that should be directly addressed within the physics community itself.
What I like to say I do, because I think it's true, is foundations of physics, largely. And I don't use the word philosophy because it doesn't seem to describe what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, at a fundamental level, what is the physical world? And someone can say, but that sounds like physics. And I would say, yeah, it does, doesn't it? It really ought to be something that physicists are worried about. But oddly enough, or unfortunately for weird historical reasons, you can't get a job in a physics department if your interest is in the foundations of physics. You just can't.
Furthermore, if we look at the specific questions themselves, we find that we can often accommodate an answer from these questions within the various scientific disciplines. As an example, consider questions that have been more or less relegated to scientific domains, which were once part of the normal practice for the philosopher. These include, among others, questions such as how to live the good life, which more naturally lie under the purview of psychology, what it means to see, which is naturally addressed within ophthalmology, neuroscience and psychology, and what constitutes matter, which is addressed within physics, and finally, asking how should uncertainty be measured is addressed within statistics and mathematics. Hence, we clearly see here a repeating pattern throughout history of tackling what were once clearly considered philosophical problems, which were then subsequently turned around and relegated to the domain of science. This motivates a temptation among proponents of scientific metaphysics to get away from unverifiable speculation arising from the armchair. In fact, philosophers such as Ladyman, Ross, and Collier argue in their book Everything Must Go that the current practice of metaphysics lies in shambles, where one cannot go about treating human intuitions as if they reveal deep structures of our corresponding reality, where this apparatus might have evolved, as the philosopher Quine suggests, in terms of truth tracking designed for another purpose. That is, it evolved from the notion that providing truth was more evolutionarily advantageous in terms of fitness than falsehood. Yet, nonetheless, let us remember that intuitions were adapted in human relations, social contexts, and not for figuring out the true nature of the atom, or to give insight into the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, for example. Incidentally, our ability to truth track is also an empirical question, which one could argue speaks in favor of adopting a scientific metaphysics research program done away from the philosophical armchair. Moreover, when it comes to fundamental physics, Ross and others argue that domesticating metaphysics, such as seen in representations of homely images of little particles swirling around like billiard balls, that on the one hand provided some basis of success in the past, has no home in 21st century science. It is also a fact in science, as in mathematics, that one as a researcher goes around with embedded intuitions in terms of how things really are, yet continually have their intuitions broken, such as with counterexamples or conjectures that turn out to be false, as well as typical falsifications and new discoveries within science. Thus, our modern science tells us that the world is not structured in the same way common sense suggests. This leads us to ask then, why should we expect our common sense cognitive habits, adapted from social interactions from prehistoric times, to accurately give us insight into the modern underpinnings of current scientific epistemic discoveries? Using this line of reasoning, we might argue here that using intuitions to constrain metaphysics risks making metaphysics parochial and scientifically obsolete, which would, as many have argued, speak to the failings of modern metaphysics as currently practiced within philosophy departments around the world. As an alternative, one could alternatively want that metaphysics should aim to follow the structure of our best informed scientific theories, which would again align with an objective-oriented metaphysics. Here, one would start off by consulting our best scientific account of the world, then move from here to ask the questions about what ontology is required giving this scientific picture. To move on to the second point regarding the view's implications concerning how metaphysics is currently practiced, it should be clear now, I think, from this motivated criticism coming from the scientific metaphysics camp, that they not only want to severely modify the current practice, but also radically overthrow it in many cases. This means that proponents of scientific metaphysics want to make philosophy continuous with scientific practice, where the roots of being tied to an autonomous armchair discipline are completely, pun intended, de-rooted. Note here that it should not be the case that a priori reasoning, intuition, conceptual analysis, or common sense appeals are never referred to, but rather that these tools are not autonomous in their own right and need to be both informed and accommodated by current scientific practices. To put it in a different way, if we really want metaphysics to describe the structure of reality, then it should be constrained by physics, biology, cognitive science, and other mature sciences, not by ordinary intuitions about tables, objects, causes, or other hand-waving analytic arguments from the armchair. To end off this section, we might iterate that if we are to ask questions such as what are the ultimate objects of reality, then it does not suffice to answer such questions using assumptions inherited from ordinary experience, rather than from current scientific practice. Now, to get to the final section of the video, addressing suggestions from this philosophical program, as well as some critiques of the view, we start off by noting some suggestions that have been made from scientific metaphysics. One would be to demand a sense of scientific constraint to avoid speculative systems from staying a major component of traditional metaphysics. This means that notions such as metaphysically impossible should be dropped, as it is not at all clear how to both give a rigorous definition of the concept as well as clearly state a demarcation from what is metaphysically impossible versus metaphysically possible. Another suggestion would be to limit possible cases talk, elaborate thought experiments, and demanding that these be, as we saw before, constrained by scientific practice. Lastly, instead of starting off with making generalizations from ordinary objects and intuitions, one should aim at using mature, developed scientific theories instead as a starting point. To end off, we should also observe that while proponents of scientific metaphysics want to apply more naturalism to the domain of metaphysics, this is still a different project than to eliminate it altogether in the same way as the logical positivist wanted, for example. For the latter adopted that metaphysics was devoid of cognitive meaning.
The logical positivists argued that most metaphysical discourse is just meaningless. They had a criterion of meaningfulness for statements, sometimes called the verification criterion. So the idea was that a statement is meaningful, cognitively meaningful, in the sense of can either be true or false, if and only if it's verifiable.
To generalize, we should say that scientific metaphysics is much more beholden to science than traditional metaphysics is, both in practice and in theory. I should also mention here that there have been historical attempts at uniting science much more with philosophy, for the whole branch of philosophy of science in general is much more optimistic to this approach, I would say. One example that comes to mind is the logical imperatist Hans Reichenbach, for instance, and his book The Rise of Scientific Philosophy, to give one example. Alright, so now having given an overview, seen some implications and suggestions coming from this camp, we end off this video by discussing some brief criticisms. As was already quite apparent from the list of suggestions discussed earlier, scientific metaphysics can be guilty of not providing a very detailed account of how to move forward in metaphysics. Metaphysics, which already evolved from a more ancient past in the 19th century, is for instance full of appeals to modern science already, where the opposing side then has to claim that the interaction and collaboration is insufficient in terms of its overall practice. Furthermore, if scientific metaphysics becomes deeply entangled with scientific practice, it means that metaphysics is on very tentative grounds and subject to change as often as science is. Critics have then called this practice as being particularly unstable, as it may undermine itself too often. Other criticisms are that its practice may overemphasize parts of science, in particular fundamental physics, and may obliterate the boundary between philosophical interpretation of science and scientific practice itself. Lastly, another critique, which is again related to vagueness or giving a lack of detail, is the argument that scientific metaphysics has trouble explaining its own methodology, in particular to give a sufficient account of what is meant by a scientifically informed metaphysics and how it should be distinguished from science itself. Okay then, that wraps up this short account of scientific metaphysics, where we looked at the view and its criticisms. There are more videos coming out on philosophy of science related stuff, so stay tuned for that. And if you like this video, you can subscribe and like and share and do all that good stuff. So yeah, see you soon. Cheers.